This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Travis Rivers is a key figure in the history of the Texas-California connections we've traced in this podcast. He was an early leader in the Haight-Ashbury scene and founder of the influential underground paper, the San Francisco Oracle. Travis was the catalyst for Janis Joplin's work with Big Brother and manager of Tracy Nelson and Mother Earth. He joins us today from California. Welcome, Travis.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good.
Travis is one of the, with one exception, I've never had the opportunity to sit and talk to him, though I met him when I was 12 years old. And he came to Austin once several years ago, and he came by the house and we had a visit, and I was flabbergasted that he came over and was really tickled that he had.
I wanted to start maybe with some memories of your growing up in Texas and in Austin in particular, and how those experiences at UT shaped the directions your life took.
Well, Austin was... And, well, I mean, it still is to some extent. Austin was a wonderful place to grow up. There were way less than 100,000 people there. My family had been there since the 1880s, and my father was at UT when I was born, and 2 days later, World War II was declared, and he joined the Army Air Corps. So for the next few years, we moved around the country to little-known air bases where powers that be felt that the Huns might try to cross our borders. We were bivouacked at Spearfish, South Dakota, where one morning I couldn't get out the front door because the snow was so deep. And from there to Marfa, another flowering spot on the planet where it's often over 100 degrees. And from there, then to the really hot spot, Yuma, Arizona. So when the war ended, we were about to be moved to California. And so we came back to the UT and lived on that flat land in front of what used to be the Armadillo South Austin facility. That was all cheap World War II housing for UT students on the GI Bill. Then my dad decided that he wanted to live in the country, so we moved it's in the middle of Lake Whitney now, that little town is. And then we moved into Whitney. I believe when I was living there, Willie Nelson was probably the DJ at the local station. That's when where I went to the first grade, and then to Lampasas, and where I went through the fourth or fifth grade, and then back to Austin, and I lived there for the next 15 years or so. I mean, movies were a nickel or 8 cents. A soda pop was a nickel. I loved it. I had a paper route. I was very good at my paper route. I think only 8 houses on the entire route didn't take the paper from me. And kids from other routes would hire me to come and sell on their route so that they could also win a trip to the state fair in Dallas. My mom used to introduce me to folks as my little entrepreneur. Then in high school, I worked I did the holidays at Western Auto. I still had my paper out, so I did that every morning. And I had so many papers that on Sunday they had to drop them every block. They had to drop my load every block because there's only so much you can carry. And I worked every evening at the Safeway on Airport Boulevard at 50th. So thus the little entrepreneur. But we went to high school. Ran out of courses to take, so I took a drama course. The teacher there decided that he should introduce me to Dr. Baker at the Dallas Theater Center. So the summer of '60, I went to Dallas and studied at the Dallas Theater Center, and came back to UT. And when Gilbert and the other guys got fired for their quote-unquote inappropriate Christmas issue, I was asked to be the circulation manager for the Ranger. And I discovered that no one had ever done this, but if you were to make a profit, staff could spend the money any way they wanted. So I let everybody know that if they went out and hawked the Ranger on campus, they could come to the Ranger party.
You're the origin of the Ranger parties.
Well, no, they had Ranger parties parties before, it was more like a fraternity. Only very special people got to go. So it was considered a big plus to go to a Ranger party. So, of course, everybody wanted to sell the paper or the magazine, and we made a huge profit, and thus we had very large gatherings. Franklin Gillian, I don't know if you knew who he was, but he had the Brick Row Bookshop. And the Brick Row Bookshop was very powerful. The IRS used Franklin to assay collection that rich people would give to various universities to make sure that they weren't overvaluing their tax deduction. And so, he was an important player in the antiquarian book world. And for some reason, he took a liking to me, financed and helped me start the Travis Bookshop. So I was a beard in a way. And in other words, there were some folks who refused to sell to Franklin because he was kind of prickly and weird and difficult to be around. And so they would come to me and I would, make a reasonable offer for whatever it was. I pissed Franklin off basically by, I got actual first edition of The Great Plains by Walter Prescott Webb, and gave it to their family because they did not have one. That really upset him. I should have charged them for it, he thought, for a big charge. But at any rate, the Dr. Wooten's building was surrounded by KTBC. Lyndon had to build his building in an L shape around that beautiful building because Wooten wouldn't sell the place. And I, being a cheeky asshole, I would sail airplanes up on his patio. So when he became vice president, when he was still vice president, I was constantly under surveillance by Secret Service guys. You couldn't miss them. They were wearing horn-rimmed Ray-Bans and sharkskin suits and skinny ties. They were always asking for fishing books and hunting books. So when this wonderful old woman gave me a priceless collection of lefty literature from the 20s on, all signed by the authors. And I asked her why she was getting rid of this stuff. And she said that her son was married to a social climber from Houston and thought it inappropriate that her husband, the vice president at Mobil Oil, had a lefty for a mom. And so they were putting her into an old age home. I said, so why don't you she said, well, I want to buy my grandchildren some gifts before I go. And that lady's house became Oat Willie's. Literally.
Wow.
So anyway, she was a wonderful woman. Now I had all these lefties sneaking in, paranoid, schizophrenic wackos sneaking in to look over the left-wing books. And so I put all the sports books and all the hunting and fishing books in the same room with the lefties so that everybody could enjoy one another's company. Shortly thereafter, I was let go. So I had given my 3x5 card collection of all the poetry chapbooks to UT because they wanted to start collecting all of these magazines and little booklets of poetry from all over the United States. So I went to the office and asked if maybe I knew that they had boxes and boxes now. They bought everything that every one of these little magazines had in back issues, and they were all stored in one room in the basement of the tower. So I suggested that maybe I would be the right guy to catalog the stuff and put it into some sort of order. I did this at the chancellor's office, and they said they'd get back to me in a few days went by, and I got a call and said that Mr. Ransom would like to see you. Oh, okay. So I got all gussied up. I put on my suit and tie and my loafers, and I went over to see Mr. Ransom. He explained to me that, yes, I would be the perfect person to do that, but he had asked around and had discovered that I had some friends and associates that were questionable. And he thought maybe if I did 6 months as a janitor in the undergraduate library, then they would think about me getting a better position. Okay.
Obviously, you had this archival skill in working in the libraries, but I've also seen you referred to as a janitor, and I was always trying to figure out how those things fit together.
Yeah. Harrowing. Not a fun time. So I did my time, so to speak.
Eddie, I wanted to bring you in because y'all crossed paths as young men. You had kind of this vision of Travis because you were younger, Eddie. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to know who Travis Rivers was?
I just remember Travis was the only guy that had excessive smarts and an attitude. He was not going to be bothered with football, and that was pretty impressive right there because he was big. He had a demeanor that nobody else had. I think under Travis's influence, I started carrying books with me in high school that were over my head, but I had them because I've always had a thing about having books. We built a house on Avenue B. I had a really large room upstairs. My room had a bookshelf from floor to ceiling along half the room and then out into the middle of the room. So the room was divided into this sequestered sort of office-y, library-like room. And then the other half was, bed and footballs and stuff. I don't know what came first, the books or the bookshelves, but about the time that all of that was mine, an old pastor died from the church right down from Hyde Park Baptist Church. He had an incredible library. He had 2 or 3 different widely divergent sort of degrees, from philosophy to medicine, and they sold his books for 50 cents a box load.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, I had absolutely no interest in most of those books, but my God, there are boxes this big for 50 cents full of books. And here I had all of these bookshelves. I embarked on a life of surround sound and books. I was forced to take, music lessons. And so I turned all of the, my Chopin and Bach into rock and pop. Pretty much an ideal situation. I was always kind of a loner, but nobody knew it, and I didn't hesitate to talk when I was prodded. But I was always pretty content to hang by myself because I didn't know anybody else that was interested in the same stuff. They didn't know what I was interested in by looking at the books because that didn't make any sense at all.
They would say things like, "This kid must really like theology."
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I ended up majoring in a combination of literature and philosophy, but I still have 3 hours to go for a degree.
Any day now.
Well, I'm pleased to be among book people. It makes me feel a little less like I have a problem with all of these stacks piling up around me. So yeah, bring us back into the libraries here. I feel like we were going through with that. Like you did, I think you also did some recording at that time. Was that connected to library and archive activities?
No, it's just one of the things that I also knew a lot of players, a lot of musicians.
Travis, did you have any connection with Terry Owens back then?
Yes, I knew Terry. I knew
because he was hanging out at Tracy Nelson and recording those sessions, and then went on and finally got in some pretty serious trouble when he got to be a junkie.
Well, yeah, he stole Alice's D18, for instance. I knew a lot of jazz musicians. I knew some country people. I knew Lanny and Powell pretty well. One of my favorite things about Lanny was that he heard these Earl Scruggs recordings where there was this sound in it, and he couldn't figure out. He did a little research, and he discovered that Scruggs had a thing called Scruggs tuners. So he checked out how much a set of Scruggs tuners would cost him, and of course he couldn't afford that. So he got into the garage, and he took 2 16-penny nails and bent them at a right angle and drilled a hole in the stock of his banjo and made his own Scruggs tuners. And so I was pretty impressed with Lanny. And Powell, of course, holy smokes, what a talent playing a chromatic harmonica. Wow. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. At the end of the Second World War, all these commanding officers were still in competition with one another to have the best orchestra, the best band. They wanted bragging rights. And so these commanding officers at various bases would comb through the inductees and try to pick out the best musicians and have them put with them. Austin was sort of in the center. In the late 50s, these kids would get their weekend passes, and they would all drive to Austin, and they would play Friday night at the Tropicana, Saturday night at the Flamingo Lounge, and then Sunday afternoon at the Deluxe Hotel in East Austin, because they had to drive back to their various bases, so they couldn't do a night gig. One Friday, when I walked over to the Tropicana, there were 5 cars with trailers on the back of them parked on the street. 4 of them had xylophones in them, and 1 was empty. So that's how famous these jam sessions were, that all these guys had brought their acts with them, but they only needed 1. Bobby Bradford, who took Don Cherry's place in Artie Coleman's band, was there. Fred Cannon, the reed player. These were incredible musical events for me as far as I was concerned. And I would be the only white kid in the joint, But, even though I wasn't 21, it's an African-American bar, let him in. He's okay. Don't worry about it. I knew Bobby pretty well. That's why I could get by. When Bobby came back from New York, he took a job maybe in Navasota. I can't remember what town it was, some little town down there. And he called me and said that he had taught his high school band Sketches of Spain. He had orchestrated it for the band, and he was so proud. They were going to perform it at the halftime for their homecoming game. And I said, I've got to come see that. He said, I don't know. That may not be bad. I don't know. I'll call you. So he called me and he said that I could come. And he had okayed it with the mayor, the sheriff, and the principal of the school. And there I was, the only white boy in the stands. But man, oh man, that was fabulous. Seeing the kids all dressed in their uniforms performing Sketches of Spain, marching across the football field. So, and there was Dessau Hall.
Hilltop?
Yes, the Hilltop. Big band room. I remember being in there and seeing 2 drum kits on the stage. This is, a swing band. Texas swing band, full horn section, and wow, pretty progressive stuff.
And you mentioned Navasota. Would you have known Mance Lipscomb at this time?
Yes, I spent a lot of time with Mance. He was a very sweet guy. I got him playing in San Francisco, for instance, at the Avalon. Truly amazing guy. Did he ever tell you the story about playing at the Monterey Folk Festival first time?
No.
He'd never been on an airplane. So he got on the airplane. He said that this woman came over and put her hands in my lap, scared me to death, trying to get him to put his seatbelt on. And he said, we got there. He says, I always play with my eyes closed. I said, yeah. And he said, man, I'm up there and I playing Motherless Child Blues, and I started hearing these thumps, and I just didn't know what the hell was going on. He says, I opened my eyes, kind of afraid, and they were throwing roses at me. I love that.
Oh yeah,
wonderful human being. Another wonderful human being is Bobby Charles.
Yep.
The Minnie Pearl had opened a chicken joint over by Vanderbilt in Nashville, and so I had driven over there to it's grand opening. I bought a bucket of gizzards, and there was this kid standing behind me. He said, "You ordered gizzards?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can I have some of them?" I said, "Sure." So we went out and we sat on the hood, and we were sharing this bucket. I said, "So what are you doing here?" And he says, I'm a songwriter." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Man, I'm always looking for materials." He says, "My office is over on 19. He says, "You should come on over." And he said, "Well, maybe I will." I said, "Good." I said, "Come over. I got a piano. I got guitars. I got all that crap there. You can just play me some." He said, "Well, I have to bring you a tape." And I said, "Really? Why is that?" He said, "Well, I don't play no musical instruments." I said, "Well, how do you write tunes?" He said, I don't know. It's just a gift God gave me." And I said, "All right." And I said, "Boy, Charles, Bobby, his name sounds damn familiar." He says, "Have you written something I might know?" He says, "Oh, yes, I wrote Walking to the Islands and See You Later, Alligator." I said, "Oh, yeah, you definitely need to come over." He said, "You know how I wrote See You Later, Alligator?" And I said, "No, Bobby, how?" He said, "Well, it's how we used to try to get shit started, like groovy and things like that." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I was working on See You Later, Alligator. How musicians always want to go out at night and get get something to eat in the middle of the night? I said, yeah. She said, we was over there in the Bourbon Street at one of those all-night eateries, and I was tired, so I got up to walk away, and I went up to the front door and turned around and said, see you later, alligator. And as the door was closing, I heard one of those little chickies say something. And I said, what? I raced back in. I said, I'm not mad at nothing. He said, I'm not mad. He said, but one of you girls said something to me. I said, see you later, alligator. And she said, after a while, crocodile. I said, thank you very much. He said, you know what the structure of that tune is? You know, the rhythm of that tune? I said, no. He says, it's my mama stomping the floor up above me saying, shut up, Bobby, shut up. To flower that out, I've always known a lot of interesting people that did different stuff, and successfully in many cases.
And it sounds like, I mean, that goes back to your Austin days. You were already kind of plugged into the counterculture and the artists, or the first flowerings of that.
Yes, but things became tougher and tougher for me in Austin. I mean, I was definitely on the radar. So one day, it was a real windy day, and a newspaper came flying down Guadalupe and wrapped around my leg. I couldn't kick it off. And so I reached down and I pulled it up, and there was an early showing of Help at that wonderful old theater that was out by Lamar Junior High that had the rocking chairs in it. The Americana, I think maybe was its name. So I went to the film and sat through it twice. And on the third time it started, Gilbert and all those kids from the old Ranger came in and sat down. They didn't see me. About halfway through the film, I convinced myself that what the story is that you could be anything you want. All you have to do is try. And so I went back to the house and painted a sign that said headed west, yard sale, and sold everything I had and drove to California. I had run into a person who gave me some information about an A-frame in Big Sur, and it belonged to Margaret Mead, so I got permission to live there. I mean, you know, I'd been working since I was 8 years old, so I felt like I could use a break. That's what I did for 6 months or so. I literally lived on the west side of Highway 1, and you couldn't see my little house because I'm way down the cliff. Etienne Pelletier lived on top of the mountain. I was a beautiful painter, and he taught me how to fish for cabezon and abalone. So that's what I lived on. So one day I woke up and I said, I've had enough. And I hitchhiked back to San Francisco. To backtrack us just a hair, I've known Chet for a long time. He asked me to come and see this band he was putting together called Big Brother. And they were playing at a movie theater in Berkeley. Afterwards I said, hey, Janis. I mean, you should get Janis to come. I mean, I like the band. It's just, and he said, we don't want no girls in the band. I go, oh, okay. So I go to Big Sur. I come back. I hear that they're auditioning girls because Grace has had a hit. So everybody's thinking, we should have a girl in the band. I go over to see Mo, and he said, oh, where have you been? He said, I've been looking everywhere for you. I said, well, yes. I said, I was in Big Sur. He says, I don't have time to talk about it right now. And he pulled out a 3x5 card and he wrote an address on it, and he sent me off. I said, holy shit, I'm on foot. I'm in Berkeley, and he wants me to go look at this place in San Francisco. Oh. So 3 buses later, I arrive on this street called Haight, and I go to this address, and it's clearly an old Woolworths. It's empty. And I look around, and there's this little store across the street called the Psychedelic Shop. So I wander in over there and say hi and look around. And there's a really Skid Row bar open. There's a bowling alley down at the end of the street next to the park. There's a haberdashery, a little clothing store called Fashion something or other. But most everything else is boarded up. I mean, it's a dead street. So, I take 3 buses. I get back to Mo, and he says, so what'd you think? I said, well, Mo, I don't know. It's a beautiful building. It's all woodwork and stuff. I mean, it's a turn of the century Woolworths. Why did you send me over there? He says, well, I wanted to know what you thought about it. I'm thinking of opening a bookstore there. And I said, who's going to buy the books? This whole street's boarded up. He said, well, the students, that's 2 or 3 miles away. I mean, you're right here by Sather Gate. It's like, of course students are going to come here. And so the other, it's that Catholic school up on the hill, they're not going to walk down there, buy some books, and then lug them back. He said, well, I've already bought the building. Be a great bookstore. I said, why did you want me to see it? He said, I want you to run it. And I said, oh, wow, okay. So it turned out in San Francisco, in order to have a used anything, you had to have a secondhand dealer's permit. So we go in front of the Board of Permits, and they say, literally, and I quote, if we give a Jew a secondhand permit, the next thing you know, they'll be selling rags. So, holy fucking shit. Whoa. For the next few weeks, I went around, I was talking to the various people, and I came up with an idea. We should have our own merchants association, and we'd call it HIP, Haight-Ashbury Independent Proprietors. And you have a little sticker in your window saying, buy HIP. We had 90 days. We had to appeal. If you'd come down to the next meeting at the Board of Permits and say, it would be a great idea to have a bookstore. And so all these kids came with long hair and weird clothing. Mo said he discovered that we didn't need a special permit to sell new stuff. So instead, we opened the print mint and sold posters and art prints, etc. And I said, well, I'm going to be pretty busy here for a few months with that. So, Bo, would you mind if I went home and checked out my family and said hey and stuff. While I was there, I left Chet a note saying if I was going back to Austin and I'd check out Janis and see how she was doing. So I asked around. She was making all A's and doing really well. So I decided not to call her. This guy called her and said, hey, Travis is here and you can stay at my house. She tracked me down and I took her over to see a band at this little club called Fred that later became the core of Mother Earth, called the Sopwith Camel. She listened to 3 songs and said, that's what I want to do.
Do you happen to remember where the Fred
San Jacinto, right there almost at 19th Street.
This is tracing the beginning of something, right? That you're coming into Haight-Ashbury and the Haight-Ashbury coming together around these hip businesses and Janis coming into Big Brother. They're kind of intertwined in the same moment.
Word spread among the lefty types of, the wealthy folks of San Francisco that this had happened to Mo. So the first month we were in business at the print mint, I did more business than the print mint in Berkeley had done its first year. And the first 4 months or so that we were in business there, we did more business than they had done their first 5 years. So it was decided one of their kin folks should be running the store. When Ron Thalen heard this, he came rushing over and grabbed me and marched me up to the United California Bank. I still didn't know what we were doing. They had just published their first paper, The Psychedelic Oracle of San Francisco, some stupid name like that. And it was sort of like the Berkeley Barb, kids getting hit on the head with sticks and stuff. And he told the manager at the bank that he was turning the paper over to me and he was signing the bank account over to me. And we're walking back and I said, do you care that they had printed 5,000 copies and 4,400 of them were sitting on the floor of that first edition? I said, do you care that I change its name and change the way it's your paper? I said, well, okay. So I decided that I would call it the San Francisco Oracle. At the time, I called it a newspaper of the spirit. And I found a printer, Howard Quinn. I worked with artist Rick Griffin, for instance, did a beautiful Aquarian cover. And I just replicated what I had done at the Ranger. I gave people 100 papers, and if they came back and paid for them, they could have another 100. It turns out that I was the biggest employer on Haight Street because all these kids were out selling the paper. One of my most favorite moments was when I saw this one kid who I talked into selling the paper, who was living in a doorway. On about the 3rd or 4th issue, I saw him walking with new jeans and 2 bags of groceries, clearly going to an apartment. Very happy with that one.
Let's timeline this out a little bit, because almost all of the things that you're describing, we're really talking about 65 and 66, I think. So if we're going, the Beatles help through, the Human Being at the very beginning of 67. Right. That's a lot going on in this span of time.
Powell also came. Driving Janis to San Francisco, I went down to Laredo because I reasoned with Janis that she needed some more material than just the 3 or 4 songs she had written. We picked up 3 songs from Powell, one of which was Bye Bye Baby. So I told Powell that if he came out, I would put a band together for him. So he did. And I started creating the band Mother Earth. I had the old fire hall that Janis and Big Brother started rehearsing in the very beginning. It had belonged to Mouse and Kelly. And, it's like $30 a month or something stupid like that to rent this place. So I also used it as the warehouse for the Oracle. So I started putting a band together for Powell. This young woman who worked at Discount Records in Berkeley was suggested to come over and audition. So much like seeing Janis at the Hootenanny in Austin and saying, "Oh, gee willikers, that's incredible." This girl starts singing, and man, I'm telling you, I was just blown away. So she became part of the band. I was also putting together Mother Earth at the same time. I guess, like my mother said, my little entrepreneur, did the newspaper in the daytime and the band at night, so to speak.
So some of it set in motion. So it sounds like Jefferson Airplane with Grace Slick kind of, created this opportunity. All of a sudden, Chet Helms came around to thinking about A Woman Vocalist and Big Brother.
So the family dog in the very beginning was in actuality a pot co-op, and Jack Toll was the Don of the co-op.
Man, did they have a bar out in Nevada for a little bit or something?
That was the Red Dog Saloon. More mobile kids from San Francisco were going back and forth, and the Charlatans played there a lot. It was a remarkable place, but Jack, he discovered that the Fillmore could be rented for about $30 a night. So he decided to have a dance to thank all the participants in the pop co-op, so to speak. And it was a big, huge success. And so pretty soon there was this clamoring for another one. Now Jack's walking around the streets of San Francisco with a valise full of kilos. And people are, "Hey, Jack, when are we going to do another one?" And it was making him a little paranoid. So there was a meeting at the doghouse on Pine Street, and they decided that they needed a front man and that Chet was cute. So he was chosen to be the face for the family dog, and they started renting the hall at the Fillmore. And Jack saw in the paper that the San Francisco meme troupe had been busted for obscenity. And so he sent a kid over to see the man who was in charge of the meme troupe about doing a benefit to help them pay for their legal fees. And so the man behind the desk was Bill Graham. He said, "Really?" He said, "Well, what does the hall cost?" $30. "Really?" And the next thing anybody knew, Bill had a 10-year lease on the Fillmore Auditorium. The newspapers got involved, and at first they were alternating weekends, Family Dog, and then Chet told me, "Well, I found a place. It was called the Avalon." So that basically was the beginning of all of the wacky 2 concert halls.
And they're often contrasted in the history books, like Graham is more of the, a businessman and a promoter, and Chet Helms came from the culture itself. Is that a fair contrast?
Early on, Rick did a triptych for the Charlatans. And so the first 2, I've got it around here somewhere. It's a beautiful thing. It's like 6 feet wide. So the first 2 are actually Rick's posters. And the third one is by a new kid who later became very famous, but you can tell that it's by another artist if you look closely at it. And the reason the third one is from another artist is because Chet didn't pay Rick. And that was a constant problem with Chet. When Janis left him, when we didn't get paid at some gig that was up in Middle California, and I asked him for why not, he burst into tears. I said, you need an account. And my friends here, Jack Jackson was in there as shoe dog. He's a CPA. He's got a degree in accounting. Jack Jackson. Can I bring him over? Yeah. So I brought Jack over. Eventually, Jack and Scanlon and Bob Simmons were running the place for Chet. But it was too late. We were already at a place where if you wanted to break a record, you had to play Bill Graham. For instance, I got the 13th floor elevators to come out, and I booked them with Bill. They could always play the Avalon, but getting them in at Bill would mean that they would get airplay that they wouldn't get otherwise, etc. And Chet torpedoed it. In the end, they played one night in one place and one night in the next place, and their song went off the air. The day after they played at the Fillmore, their song was no longer being played on the radio stations.
And Eddie, I know that you have a later kind of encounter with Graham when you were doing your own Fillmore/Avalon thing down in Austin. What was your impression of Graham when he came to town, and how did that fit into what you were trying to do with the Armadillo?
I got the university to pay to come to Austin. They had an annual sort of themed exercise that one of the colleges on the campus did, and that year, 73, maybe, was rock and roll was the theme. And so I got involved with them slightly because I went over and tried to pitch them on letting me have that old baseball field to do a show. And as soon as I walked out, a couple of the rich kids that were on that committee decided they would do that show. They wouldn't give me permission. They booked a great, big, 4-headliner show. Subsequent to that, and almost at the same time, the idea for booking Bill Graham to come in as a speaker was brought up, and they gave him $5,000, which back then was pretty good money for somebody to come in for a speaking engagement. What I got out of it was that his main speaking venue was the Armadillo World Headquarters. So we got to draw a lot of people in for a very unusual event. I mean, I was doing the ballet on Sundays and, anything I could to put people in the place. So I've got this, great picture of Bill Graham sitting on the edge of the Armadillo stage with this, shallow sea of hippies out there. I knew a lot more about what was going on with Bill Graham in San Francisco with his whole thing than any of these, kids did in school or in the audience. And he was trying to get people to pick at him so he could cut them to shreds like he was famous for in San Francisco. But our guys were so polite that he couldn't piss them off. And finally, an actor from the Esther's Follies group, I can't remember the guy's name right this minute, but he tried, and Graham cut him to shreds so easy that nobody could even see what was going on. I mean, he just sliced him up and cast him aside. That was his final event, afternoon event, and then we got in the car for me to run him to the airport. He had got himself all pumped up, to beat up somebody, and didn't have the outlet. And so he was really frustrated. I had a small litter of small puppies in the back floorboard of the Dodge Dart that I was driving. And while we had been inside the Armadillo with that event, one of them had gotten terribly sick and he had just shit all over the place. So all the way to the airport, Graham's head was out the window of the passenger side, just on the verge of throwing up. Yeah, and he gagged and gagged and gagged. We pulled up to the airport and we were kind of running on the edge of it all. So he was anxious to get out of the car and inside the place. And we got to the ticket counter and there was a short line behind us. And he was still wanting to pick at me. The one thing he wanted to tell me was that I was never going to make it because I was just not a businessman. And hippies weren't going to make it. I said, well, you got paid pretty good money. I didn't give you a nickel of it. I'm still selling beer to that bunch of kids that was in there a while ago. They're still there drinking beer, and I'm getting rid of you now. And he was, and I turned back around, and John Henry Falk was the next person in line. And I'd been a fan of John Henry's for a long time. And John Henry stepped over and said, young fella, I just want you to know, I think you did a real good job of telling that guy how the cow ate the cabbage. And I thought that was pretty cool. And I took about 3 more steps, and here comes Bud Shrake with Dennis Hopper, who'd been in town for several days, and I'd seen him 2 or 3 times while they had been here. But Dennis was leaning on Bud, just barely able to stand up, and Bud was just dragging him toward the ticket counter. Hopper waved me over. He wanted me to lean right up to his ear, and he just smelled like worse than that puppy had, but it was alcohol. And he said, Wilson, you're doing the work of the Lord. John Henry Falk and Dennis Hopper inside of 3 minutes giving me a thumbs up. I'm on top of the world.
I got along with Graham well. He was an interesting guy. Most of that was an act. He actually was a pretty decent human being.
I got along with him after that, too. Next time that I went to New York, I went backstage. I was pretty cocky by then, I knew my way around backstage in New York on Broadway. I went backstage to Elizabeth Ashley, and I knocked on the door a couple of times and then I opened it. There was Bill Graham in there trying to put the move on Elizabeth Ashley. And when he saw me, he threw up his hands and just kind of fell back against the wall. I was everywhere. He remembered my dogs. But anyway, I got along with him, and I always had a lot of respect for everything I ever heard about him doing. He was the star of that whole scene out there. Everybody else just players in his game.
Yes, he was an interesting man. how much did he like Tracy? He booked New Year's Eve with the Chambers Brothers at the Fillmore East for Tracy. So we opened for the, and of course, this was the perfect thing. Time was one of the number one songs in America. So at midnight, of course, what did they do? They played Time. I was sad that when he died. I mean, it was not a good thing.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about this kind of like Austin to San Francisco or Texas to San Francisco connection. Of course, that scene's built from people who came from all over, but it does seem like there was a very influential network of Texans. Did most of those Texans know each other from back in Texas? Or was that something where if you met someone in San Francisco, it kind of gave you an in? Or did you like recognize one another?
No, it wasn't like a cabal. Sam Houston Andrews in Janis's band is from Houston. Oftentimes, the youngsters from New York and the youngsters from Texas seem to have a little more drive in terms of trying to get something going for themselves. My thought was for the Oracle was to create something that could be ongoing and would flourish, be self-sustaining, and I wouldn't have to do it anymore because publishing a newspaper is not that much fun. That horrible little shit, Abby Hoffman showed up and started filling people's heads with revolutionary ideas. Really fucking stupid. My whole shtick was that we would take our place in society in spite of having long hair. That we would grow and become a community. And that's what started in San Francisco. And then Abby showed up. Heroin started flowing all over the streets. I swear he was a mole for the FBI and the dark powers of this country. To this day, I blame him for the last 50 years of Republican running the country because he created a horrible thing at the 68 convention, scared the shit out of the American voting public, and put that asshole Nixon in office. So in late 68, I came to the conclusion I closed the newspaper. I gave everything to Alan Cohn, but Alan had fallen under the influence of the Brooklyn kids, the junkies from Brooklyn. Steve Levine quit. But I gave everything to Alan and left, and he never, ever put out another newspaper. I was so happy that we'd gotten our record deal and that we would start touring and that I would get away from what I saw was a failed adventure in the Haight.
Yeah, that arc is such a tight and intense one. Like what Haight-Ashbury launches into the world in terms of going on in Haight-Ashbury itself. Again, you're speaking about like if we're starting with you and help and going up through the human being is kind of that breakthrough moment at the beginning of 67. And then we're talking now by 68, it looks like things have been overwhelmed.
I got all the Haight-Ashbury independent proprietor guys who put up money, and we started the Hip Job Co-op. So we had all these kids who had degrees in social services, et cetera, running around, but had no job. So we set up a bank of phones, and they started calling businesses along Montgomery Street, and kids would go in and do temp work. Well, some of them stuck. Some of them went on and had careers. We had the free clinic. We'd feed them, give them vitamins, talk to them, and if they were amenable, we would buy them a bus ticket home. But all of that, even the dead moved out of the neighborhood. It just became tragic.
Do you have any deal with Doug
Saul? Yes. Doug once asked Tracy to not tell this story anymore. And so Doug was having a hard time getting some gigs. So I went out and I took his drummer, George Raines, his guitarist, Wayne Talbert, his pianist, and stole them. And when I brought them in, Tracy says, won't Doug be upset with this? She quotes me as saying, he stole my wife. I took his players. Doug and I were good friends. He and I were in the penthouse with Irving Green, the CEO president of Mercury Records. Irving and I talked at some length about pickers and music, and in the end, he told me to make a proposal for a recording contract, and that's how Tracy and Doug both ended up on Mercury Records. And it so upset the board at Mercury my record deal that Irving was fired, so to speak. At that point, I don't think a record contract had been given that had that much profit leeway for a band ever. The 200,000 sales, we were to get 11% of retail with no charges for recording costs, no charges for album covers or pressing, and 200,000 to tour with. That's why Steinberg wanted out of it. Steinberg, was an accountant type. I mean, he didn't have the years that Irving B. Green had. I figured the record label would not last very long. And I was right. I love Mo Austin. He was brilliant. I'll tell you a funny story about Mo. We hadn't signed with anyone yet, so one of the suitors was Reprise. Like I say, I was barefoot, and I had flown before to Los Angeles barefoot on American. But this time when I showed up at the airport, they said I couldn't get on the plane without shoes. What am I going to do? So I want to go down and I want to go see these guys at Warner Bros. So I go over to Little Hay Street. There was a store there that had a pair of English riding boots, but they didn't have any soles in them. So I was still barefoot, but I had hoof covers. And I was able to get on the airplane, and we flew to L.A. and went over to Warner Bros. And we're sitting there, and Mo and I are talking back and forth. And I forget that I don't have the bottoms of my shoes then, and I cross my legs. And we keep talking, and I asked him if there's a restroom I could use. And I said, sure. So he gave me some keys to private room next to the receptionist, and I leave the room, and Rohan, my attorney who's sitting there, tells me later, he says, Moses, I love that boy. He has chutzpah. He's asking me for $500,000, and he doesn't even have soles in his shoes. I love that boy.
So with Tracy Nelson and Mother Earth, sometimes I feel like they don't get the credit or show up in the same stories, and that kind of shift to country rock a little bit and at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how y'all came to work in Nashville on some of that material.
Tracy was never, ever actually happy in the Bay Area. She won these hootenanny contests and got a trip to L.A. She had already made that record for Elektra, and she didn't like Los Angeles particularly. So she came up to San Francisco and got the job at Discount Records. She started dating Steve Miller. Steve was never a perfect human being. So she was working at the Discount Record store. Don Ellis ran the store. So Don later became vice president of Epic. She just didn't fit in here that well. She didn't like it. And so she wanted to try recording an album in Nashville. I got on the horn from Mercury and started querying Nashville for quarters. She wanted to record at Bradley's Barn. So I found a place called the Curd Farm. But when I got there, wow, this was an original section given to Dr. Curd in 1782. We had this silly idea that we would do a side of the record that would be kind of country, and the side of the record that would be rock and rollish. Go Make a Joyful Noise was the name of the album. I think Rolling Stone finally, 40 years later, said it was one of the best albums of the era. Furthermore, Nashville is 1,000 miles to 82% of the population of the United States. So our touring costs were dropped by 70%. Recording costs were a third of what they were in LA or San Francisco. And because of our experience, the backlash of making an album in Nashville, other bands would come and record there, but make it a silent visit. No one knew they were there. If you look at Ringo Starr's country album, the cover of it, he's standing in a log cabin doorway. That was our smokehouse. Behind him, you see literally thousands of beer cans and bottles. That's where the band would put their empties. That was a wonderful time. The Bring Me Home album cover was underneath one of the trees on the property. Skaggs showed up at the farm, hoping that I might have some work for him. So he's on that one album. we gave him 15 minutes in each show. And of course, Tracy was perfectly happy with that because I wouldn't let her work. I was very careful about the amount of time I would let her be on stage because you're an athlete. I mean, you're a vocalist, you're an athlete. When she gets on a note, she produced about 112 decibels. That's louder than a jet plane is allowed to make when it takes off. I wanted her to still have a voice when we were old and gray. I made a promise to myself in my 20s I would retire from rock and roll at 40. So as I began to approach 40, I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I met my wife, Mary, a documentary filmmaker. So I decided that I would move to New York if she would have me. And she was reluctant at first. But once I got there, I applied to the Directors Guild DGA Trainees Program and was accepted. I didn't know at the time that no one over the age of 28 had ever gotten in. It hadn't occurred to me that being 40 and running around the streets of Manhattan in 4-degree weather would wear on me. It only took me about a year and a half to come to the conclusion that this was not for me. At that point, I thought, my experience of producing records, etc., managing rock and roll bands would play into a career in film. I did okay. I just ran myself into the ground. So when I declined a couple of films, and Mary and I would sort of regularly go visit in California. So we happened to be there when one of the early Mac Worlds was happening. And when we were walking away, I said, Mary, I know what I'm going to do next. And she said, what's that? I said, computers. And she said, oh, yeah, sure. So I bought a couple of Macs and I started messing around. A store, they hadn't even opened yet. I went to see them. As soon as I walked in, there was a huge man sitting behind the desk. He said, can you sell? I said, oh, yeah. He said, have you ever sold computers before? No, I haven't. And he said, He says, well, what would you work for? I said, how does 5% net profit on each sale sound to you? You're hired. Right away, in the first few months, I sold several $1 million worth of equipment. I put some of the first computers in Fortune magazine. I had a bunch of advertising agencies that would only talk to me about new equipment purchases. I had some interesting clients. And when MPC wanted to pare down my percentage, I left them and just became a consultant. One of the things that I discovered was this little company in Berkeley. Everybody wanted a scanner. And so I found this little company that was making a scanner that did beautiful scans of 35 millimeters. The software that ran it was called X. Started playing with it and said, holy smokes. So I called this kid I knew at Adobe, and he came over with a guy with a Halliburton briefcase, those really expensive silver ones. And they listened to me wax poetic about X for a few minutes, and then the briefcase opened up and he shoved some papers in front of me. It was a non-disclosure agreement, NDA. So I gladly signed it because and Wesley Lim said, we're in negotiations to buy that and we're going to call it Photoshop. And I said, oh, well, now I know that every publishing house, every newspaper in the world is going to want something that will allow them to deal with the size files that I couldn't even save because they were bigger than an 80 meg drive.
So interesting about all this is that on the one hand, it seems like a departure, but on the other, there's almost a straight line from
Correct.
Some of those innovations in printing at the San Francisco Oracle. Yeah, and we've talked about, Eddie and I, about Stuart Brand a little bit too, kind of has that sense of possibility and experimentation.
I've remarked that my entire life's career is noticing a need and filling it.
Yeah, so from a paper route to one of the very first underground papers using offset printing to these divides,
right.
These big files, and Adobe Photoshop figuring out these problems.
That's right.
The art with visual artists all thrown in and inventing the counterculture. Thanks for sharing all this with us today, Travis.
Yes, thank you.
We loved it. It was so far, so good. As the guy being asked as he jumps off the Golden Gate Bridge, how's it going? So far, so good. All right, guys.
Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters, a memoir. Do it now. Do it right.